Good afternoon and welcome to Wavy Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're going to be talking about warning labels for social media. So just about 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Surgeon General came out with an opinion in the New York Times saying that there should be warning labels for social media based on the impacts that, he's studied and they've seen on adolescents. Today, we're going to be speaking with local expert Miles McNutt, who is an associate professor at Old Dominion University of Communications and Theater Arts, about what this means, about whether or not social media does need these warning labels, and just the conversation around it. If you're joining us on Facebook and YouTube, please feel free to comment. Let us know what your thoughts are. I'll also put the question up on screen, and I'm going to bring them on to get started. Miles, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Can you just give me what were your first thoughts, seeing this opinion from the U.S. Surgeon General?
So, I mean, you and I actually have talked before when we were talking about the TikTok ban about sort of the dynamics of social media and understanding the sort of effects that it has. And certainly there's no question that when I talk about social media with my students, when we sort of engage with these issues, one of the central challenges is our understanding as a society that these can be incredibly dangerous places for people's mental health, particularly for young people, in ways that the platforms themselves often don't take full responsibility for because their goal is to increase engagement and ad revenue. These are for-profit companies that are not trying to operate in our best interest. And that means that when circumstances arise where young people are being exposed to, whether it's bullying, harassment, or simply sort of just a warped understanding of how the world works, that there is something there that we need to understand and engage with. And so my response to this is, it's nice and good that we are talking about this reality. Whether or not a warning label is the right approach to accomplish that, I think is more where this becomes a more nuanced questions and where there is more division. I don't think anybody's going to come out and say, no, social media cannot be negative towards people's mental health. I think that would be a strange take to have. But whether or not this is the best approach for confronting that, I think is more where I think media scholars broadly responded to this.
And he described it, similar to a warning label on alcohol or tobacco products, which, obviously has years and years of scientific research. Still today, things are coming out about both of those, the iterations of those, whether that be, vapes or electronic products. So even that, you see this changing landscape and you see how much time it took maybe for these warning labels to be put on in social media, and we spoke about it last time as well, the free speech and education that people need, to sort of manage these platforms. Obviously, there's downsides and positive sides, but do you think it's more user error, why social media might need these warning labels? Do you think people just aren't getting proper education? Do you think it's maybe in the wrong people's hands? I mean, what do you think are some of those things?
So, I mean, I think the function is, like you say, to me, the issue here is, fundamentally equivalency. We cannot make the argument that social media is bad for us in the same way that alcohol and tobacco are, right? Which is to say that ultimately alcohol and tobacco have very clear, measurable health effects when used in excess and in these circumstances, that there's long-term, short-term, et cetera, challenges related to that. And so we use warning labels to make sure people are aware of what those things look like. If you were going to try to create a warning label to help someone navigate social media and understand the consequences, that warning label would be like the entire body of a media literacy class that I would teach, right? You can't sum that up, right? If you were to say it's like social media can be bad for your mental health. Okay, but what makes it bad? What choices could you make? What could help that make the circumstance? Because realistically, for lots of people, and I don't know if this speaks to you or anybody else, but social media can be great for mental health. Social media helps me on a regular basis, right? If I'm flipping through something like TikTok, it's like, okay, if I have a For You page that, yes, because it's all algorithm driven, maybe it shows me a lot of content that makes me feel depressed or which adds to my anxiety or body dysmorphia or any range of different experiences that we could have on a given platform. But maybe I've curated a TikTok feed by nature of my choices, who I choose to follow, the videos I choose to watch, that's full of hopecore videos. If you're not familiar with hopecore as a genre, this is effectively accounts that will collect videos of uplifting things, whether it's cute animals, whether it's military homecomings, any sort of genre that sort of just makes you feel like there's good people out there, that there's people out there doing good things and being a part of that. And so the idea is that in that case, TikTok could be helping me get through a rough time because it's an escape from whatever my circumstances are. For all those reasons, our inability to generalize about what social media contains, you mentioned sort of like user error, but I think in many circumstances, it's the reality that like these spaces are not inherently anything. They are what we put into them, they are what we take out of them. And for that reason, we absolutely need better education on how we engage in that process. We absolutely need to understand the dynamics of what that looks like and warning signs to look out for on these platforms in terms of how things can get worse. But the idea that there's any label, like there's any like two-sentence description, that there's any like alarming image that they could show you, like they put on tobacco products in Australia with like the diseased lungs and those types of things. Like I just can't imagine a warning label system that will be able to capture the nuance and complexity of our social media experiences. And I think that attempting to claim that this will accomplish some larger goal is, I think, ultimately an overly simple solution to an inherently complicated problem.
Right. And I think, with tobacco products, with alcohol, you see those labels obviously that say, if you're pregnant, don't consume. You see labels about, how much tobacco a day could lead to problems with social media. And I want to give one stat. One study said, 3 hours of social media a day could lead to a decline in mental health for kids. But to your point, that would depend on what they're looking at, right? Are they looking at how many likes they get on social media? Are they looking at what other people are doing in their network that maybe they're not doing? What are those 3 hours spent on?
Right, and I think there's also a major challenge, like, there's no agreement on the science on this, right? Like there are all sorts of research studies done at different points in time, different populations, et cetera, that would be accomplishing this goal the same way. But I think one thing, the time element, I think is really critical for me, because it's like, look, a decade ago, it really felt like social media was organized around platforms like Facebook and Instagram, which were all about likes and attention and sort of presence. But like a space like TikTok is not as much maybe about likes, right? It's maybe not as much about putting yourself out there and creating a social network. TikTok is more about an entertainment form, right? Of experiencing and sort of engaging with that. Social media is more entrepreneurial now than it used to be, meaning that more people are using it as extension of their business or their livelihood or those types of issues. And so as a result of that, as that trickles down, I think there's no question that, like I think of this all the time and talking to my students now, like my incoming freshmen, when they were 13 years old and able to get these accounts, right? Like social media was an established part of their existence, right? And I think for those of us who are older, we came to social media at a much older age. I was in college when Facebook came out. And so as a result, like we all perceive that differently. So these studies that we're looking at, they might not reflect how a younger generation is actually seeing social media today. Where a platform like Facebook, which was in some ways the most sort of built around likes, attention, those types of issues, young people today don't use Facebook. They have no interest in Facebook or desire to be a part of that. They're on different platforms that have different dynamics attached to them. And so for all these reasons, again, it's like, maybe this is just the pragmatist in me who starts to like question logistics of any plan of this nature, but it's like, is every social media platform getting a different warning label depending on the circumstances?
Right.
Are they being tied to age? Are they being tied to all of this? Like, it's just when you start to break all of that down, you come to two things. One, I think this plan feels like a good idea until you start breaking down logistics. That's lots of plans in this context, but it's also a matter of, is there actually a help that's created if you send somebody that say this is bad? Because in many ways I would argue that sending somebody into a space that is about what you put into it, that's about how you engage with it, and telling them it's inherently negative or shaming them for being a part of it, that in the process that's maybe not the right position to get somebody to think critically about it and to explore it and to engage with it, that a warning rather than an education. I think those are two different strategies. And I feel like in the case of social media, the latter is going to end up being more productive.
And I want to go back to what you said about, how do you utilize the apps? That also is so dependent on, I think, your social circle, your age. I know that, for example, maybe more my generation on Instagram, it looks very different than maybe, what's available now. And that's partially because of, the additions and tools and things that are now available on the app. But you can see the change, to my parents and how they utilize Facebook, connecting with friends or connecting with family across the country. There are so many different ways, so many different age groups, social groups utilize these apps. So that is an interesting thing to sort of unpack about how do you say what are the negative sides, the downsides to each platform.
Yeah, and I think, one of the challenges that, often comes up, like when I have assignments in my courses where I ask them to sort of do a lot of self-reflection, which is like sort of like, look, I particularly have online courses that are kind of locked in time. So I want to know, like, what are their responses like? What are they engaging with? And I think in a lot of circumstances, some of them will say where it's just like, look, I had to get off social media, right? It wasn't working for me. It wasn't sort of playing out. But then, like, I'm going to get somebody else responding to the same prompt and talking about how, like, social media keeps them connected when they're overseas studying abroad or when they're traveling with the military, staying in touch with friends, etc. And so to me, it would be very strange and dissonant to send the message where it's just like, oh, this is a toxic space, but it's a toxic space that's obviously you're using in such productive ways. And I think that that's kind of the inability to generalize is part of where social media becomes so challenging. There's so much to sort of gauge and sort of go from. But if our goal is to say we want to make sure that this is a better experience for people, that people have a more positive social media environment to work from, there's two ways you accomplish that goal. One is obviously encouraging people and educating them and engaging with that. But the second is encouraging the platforms themselves to take on a stronger role in moderating content in those platforms and doing more on their end to sort of like encourage this process of protecting people against content that might be harmful and by ultimately sort of like better educating them in that process. And so I think that by putting a label on it, are we also in some way maybe letting these platforms off the hook by saying that, like, okay, now there's a warning on it that it's dangerous, the platforms now bear less responsibility to deal with these respective problems because it's like, oh, well, they were warned about it. So now it's no longer an issue if Instagram is showing them harmful content because they were told that this could happen. And I feel like that completely absolves these platforms of what should be a social responsibility. And that kind of goes to the larger regulatory question that's at the core. The TikTok bans, the core of some of the larger tensions over Facebook in the past, that I really feel like needs to be more the conversation than the suggestion that, people need to steer clear of or enter into very warily spaces that should be welcoming, right? That should be a space for them to discover themselves, their identities, and make connections with others.
And that's an interesting ownership issue. Who should be sort of the one pushing for things? Is it, and this could be years in the making, but is it Congress that is going to set the rules and regulations of how to utilize these? Is it up to the app, either founders or now, purchasers and CEOs to decide how the app is going to be run? So that's an interesting point. Does the warning label absolve the companies, from maybe the detriments of their platforms? That'll be a really interesting thing to see.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be hard because, ultimately, the government has been very limited to step in because you can't control the content, which means then you just have to control access to the airways. Everything happening with TikTok right now and where that's going to go in the courts is going to be obviously a big part of that conversation. But I think in terms of thinking about like what the role of these CEOs are, it's just like, look, these are stockholder run companies, right? Like their goal is to make profit. Their goal is to make money. And so ultimately that is their only real objective. Like they're not trying to connect us to other people. They're not trying to make us feel better. They are trying to do whatever it takes for us to engage with their platform in a way that helps them sell advertising and engage in these types of practices. And as long as that is their priority, right, we are subject to that. And we need to know that, right? Like if there's a single warning label that I would put in these platforms, it has nothing to do with studies on mental health. It would have everything to do with this is a for-profit company, that you are the product. Like you are what they are selling to advertisers. Your engagement is what they are ultimately cultivating. Your attention is their currency. And if we know that, then maybe we better understand the dynamics of why we're being pushed in certain directions, why a platform like TikTok is like relying on TikTok Shop to kind of drive commerce through this app and thinking about the consequences. To me, that is a blanket statement we can apply to all these platforms that would start that process of education Whereas a warning label about mental health is not going to apply in all circumstances, and I don't feel really necessarily reflects the challenges therein.
And in terms of education, another thing is a Gallup survey said the average adolescent 4.8 hours a day on social media apps like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. That could be something where that, in terms of education, is whether that's parents, guardians, teachers talking about, hey, maybe, 30 minutes and then take a break or whatever that is, just like when you were a kid doing homework in the evening and you got 30 minutes to watch TV and then go back. But is setting some of those limits that could be for a child specifically, that could be the cure, for conversations.
Well, and I think ultimately, like, look, a lot of this boils down to like the principle of parental responsibility. Again, is not to absolve the platforms of needing to create spaces that create more positive dynamics, but ultimately, yeah, it comes down to those types of choices. We talk a lot about the impact of screens, right? The idea of screen free. Like, this was not a thing when I was a kid, but they started to do like screen free weeks, right? The idea, like in schools, you would have like everybody didn't watch TV for a week, or kind of engage with screens in any capacity. And I mean, as much as I understand where that comes from and respect any parent who applies those particular policies, I think at the same time that like responsible use of those screens is ultimately what's at heart. So like if we're including YouTube in that list of platforms, YouTube could be used to do homework, right? For entertainment, for education, for things that have nothing to do with sort of mindless activity, but that are instead about sort of learning and digging deeper. It could also be a rabbit hole to like some insane conspiracy theories because YouTube is YouTube. But like the idea being that like the platform itself and its use of it could be functional in so many different ways. And so I think for that reason, for parents to say, well, you can only have 30 minutes of time, what you do in that 30 minutes is what matters, right? The amount of time, you could have an hour and a half of incredibly productive time with social media if it's being understood and used in a way that sort of serves those goals. And so I think the best advice, speaking not as a parent, and therefore I would never try to supersede one's kind of own instincts in this context, is just like to understand how your kids are using social media, I think is more important than the amount of time that they're spending. I think we like to look at time as this important metric, but if someone's just sort of watching YouTube kind of like randomly and haphazardly for 45 minutes versus someone who's really thinking about YouTube as a form of education, of interest, of kind of getting to know more about a subject they're passionate about, and sort of digging into. I have a course I teach about theme parks, and I have talked to people who make YouTube videos in that space, where people who don't have a theme park near them get connected to this whole industry and learn so much about it and become really invested in it just by consuming other people's content and engagement. And then they follow that as a career path. They explore the potential of sort of engaging in that industry and being a part of it. It's a matter of when you understand how social media is being used, you have a better chance to engage with that and to sort of think about it. And that's what ultimately we should be doing, is having conversations with young people, with anybody, like I do with my students, like, what are you doing on these platforms? What do you see them as? What are they for? Getting them to reflect. Like, I know they don't make their kids do assignments. That's my job. But like, I mean, the very idea of like asking them to talk about where it's like, what do they get out of YouTube? Right? Like, what is YouTube to them? Like, what is it offered to them that they want to engage with? That to me could give you some real insights that would help you understand how to build on that, how to take YouTube not as just an end to itself, but as an opportunity to develop new hobbies, to explore new interests. Same with something like TikTok. As the FYP develops and emerges, there's an opportunity there to use that into things that are not social media that might sort of extend those opportunities. I think that's sort of the core of it, that social media is an incredible gateway. It can be a gateway to deeply unsettling things and to mental health struggles, but can also be a gateway to self-discovery and understanding. And as long as that's the case, being able to have those conversations, being able to sort of engage with that, whether in educational environments or family environments, seems to me the most crucial solution.
And, there's a comment in the chat, about warning labels for news stations. And I usually wouldn't bring that up, but I do because, when, Trump was president, there were conversations about, what warning labels do we need? And I think to your point, and to as well on the internet, learning the right tools on how to fact check, learning the right tools on how to know if it's a real source, to know what you're getting yourself into. Those tools could be critical. So maybe it's, to your point, educating kids. Growing up, we had computer class. Nowadays, having those technology classes about how to utilize those tools, how to utilize social media, how to utilize the internet to your advantage, knowing what the point is, knowing sort of maybe where the dangers are. I mean, do you think that is something, especially, I guess, in your teaching, obviously at the university level, could be something that kids should have growing up now because it's such a part of their fabric?
I think, when thinking of translating that to news, trollish as that comment is at its core, right? We have to sort of acknowledge that there's this principle where it's just like, well, okay, this question of bias. It's like everything has perspective, right? Nothing comes from this purely objective place. Everything comes to our interpretation and our capacity to manage that and our ability to discern truth of these experiences and engage with that accordingly. And that's complicated, right? It's more complicated than we want to admit it is. When we hear blanket statements about the news, about social media, about all these things, but everything is this, everything is that, you can't trust anything. And it's just like, well, no, there's objective truth that exists in the world that we have to be able to sort of discern out and figure out. But where do we develop that skill? Like, where does that come from, right? Like, how do we tap into that? And the simple answer to that question is we develop our versions of it and manage it as best we can. And in the process, social media can be an incredible help for that. For instance, during the most recent presidential debate, it was doing lots of fact checking in real time if you found it out. But that implied that you developed a feed that gave you that information, as opposed to one that simply sort of parroted one view or another in a given circumstance. And ultimately, we live in bringing the political into it reminds us that like there are lots of reasons ideologically, politically, etc., that we don't seek out an objective truth, that we accept these very sort of like positions that kind of built off of that. That's a reality of our world. And social media is a thing that can absolutely just kind of amplify that like false reality we live in, or it's one that can break it down and give us different insights and different perspectives and ways of understanding that. And so I think for that reason, we need to understand and embrace social media's capacity to create something different, to create something meaningful, while acknowledging that doing so requires context, perspective, and guidance. And whether that's a course, certainly I would hope to see more media literacy courses before they get to me, before they get to our world. But at the same time, I also understand there's a lot of other things in this world that we need guidance on in different circumstances. And I think that reorganizing any curriculum is challenging, particularly in a context where if we start thinking about media literacy as a partisan act, that if the suggestion is that making people aware that there are lies on the internet, that we need to discern what is truth or not from information, if we start to perceive that as some way a political idea targeting one particular group, one particularly loud voice, kind of which who tends to spread mistruths in this context, it becomes much harder to have that conversation. And I think that's maybe one of the challenges we're facing when it comes to media literacy, is accepting that this is something we should all be for, regardless of one's political background, rather than something that seems to be coming from one side more than the other.
Well, as by evidence of this conversation, obviously we're not going to see warning labels anytime soon. There's so much to break down in this conversation and so many different things to look at. Miles, is there anything else that you want to hit home or that really you wanted to highlight about these, social media warning labels or just advice in general for people, utilizing these platforms?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a very, personal responsibility answer. And I don't like to suggest, again, I don't want to absolve these platforms in any way. They should do way more than they do. But like, if a social media app is not bringing you joy or it's not giving you some sort of opportunity, like, get off of it. Like, I say this all the time, like, when it comes to what Twitter has become over time, I'm still going to call it Twitter, but platform now known as X, in this context. What it's become under Elon Musk's leadership is concerning and alarming, and in many ways against the values that one holds. But if it is still providing like value to someone, if you can still get something out of it that's supporting you and your mental health and your work in your life, etc., that is an understandable position. Same with somebody who chooses, I can't do that anymore, I need to step away, Instagram's not working for me. I think the idea that there's some sort of social responsibility to being on social media doesn't track, right? Like, this is not a requirement of life. but it's sometimes a requirement for jobs, right? Certainly, if you were to say, I'm going to leave social media, that would be confusing, right? In this circumstance. And so, those of us who don't necessarily have a choice, where it's part of our life or part of our jobs, are going to make that space work for us as best we can. But as I always say to my students, it's like, look, we can prepare you and give you skills to live in these environments and function in them. But if this is not a space that works for you, that it doesn't help you in some tangible way, like get off of it. Like, don't, if someone's like, well, you're not on Facebook anymore, who cares? Right? Like, let that be a space that you're not operating in and let your focus be somewhere that works better for you. And so, yes, if that is a warning label I'm putting on social media, it's just trying to tell people that it's not a requirement that they're there, that ultimately these platforms rely on them to be there. But ultimately, if that relationship is not working for you, step out of it, deactivate your account, touch grass, kind of be a part of a different part of society. And I think that that's a totally rational choice, even if for some of us, we are too deeply embedded to ever consider it.
I know I'm in that camp of deeply embedded, but I definitely have people in my life who are off of it, and I love that advice that we can end on of have that autonomy, have that power to take yourself out of the equation if that's what's best for you and your mental health. But Miles, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Obviously, this is going to be a continuing conversation, just as with TikTok's decisions and things there. But thank you so much for your expertise and for giving us insight on this topic.
Thank you.
For anyone watching later, please go to wavy.com. We're going to have more information. You can see what the U.S. Surgeon General's opinion was. You can also find more research and articles from experts on topics on social media platforms that we've spoken to in the past, like Miles. So you can find out more on wavy.com.